some passengers were transferred from the laid-up IMM ships. Eva Hart and her family were originally booked on the Philadelphia.
We were booked in a ship called the Philadelphia. And this cold strike came and she didn't sail. And we were then offered a berth in the Titanic, which absolutely delighted my father. I thought it was wonderful. The whole world was talking about that ship. And my mother had this dreadful premonition. She'd never had one before and she never had one after. But she said, no, we can't do this. It's quite wrong. Something dreadful will happen. And I tell you what the sort of woman she was. She'd got both feet on the ground, and for her to behave like that was absolutely unbelievable to everyone. But she just had that premonition. I was 7. I'd read there was a big ship. It didn't really convey as much to us as it did to my parents, obviously. I mean, I'd never been in a ship at all before, so it didn't convey very much to me. But I do know everyone was talking about it.
It was inevitable that the Titanic would sink. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, confirmed this to Captain Smith. But still, the passengers were unaware of their imminent peril.
I was in bed, of course. And she just came and joined in whatever was happening during the evening, that sort of thing. And my father got very cross because he had every reason to dislike gambling. His father had been a compulsive gambler and had died utterly penniless from being quite a wealthy man. And so everybody was gambling on this Sunday night. They were making books, I think the term is, and having sweepstakes as to what time she would get in so many minutes past so and so. My father would have nothing to do with it. And so he went to bed quite early, for him anyway. And my mother sat down to sew and read. And she looked up at him, he was reading. He said he'd got a very interesting book. But quite quickly he went to sleep and she got up and took the book from him and set her down again. And she said at 10 minutes to 12, she felt a slight bump. And she said it was just like a train pulling into a station. It just jerked. It was very slight, but she said she knew that it was this dreadful something, and she wakened my father. She wakened me, and my father said no, he wasn't going up on deck again after the night before. But she literally pulled him out of bed and made him go up. And she then said she was going to dress me, and I, being sleepy and very naughty, said I wasn't going to be dressed. Nothing to be dressed for, I'm going back to bed. My father came back very quickly because he could get up to the boat deck in the lift very quickly from where our cabin was. And he came back and he picked me up and wrapped his blanket tightly round me as if I were a baby. And my mother said nothing to him, and I used to say to her sometimes, years afterwards, I can't understand why you didn't say to him, what was it? Which she certainly did not say. And she said, I didn't have to say, what was it? I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was this dreadful something that I had to live with for months. There was nothing more I could say. So he put his very thick coat on her and put another one on himself. And without any words at all, we went out of the cabin and into the lift and up onto the boat deck. Now, if we hadn't done that at that time, I very much doubt I'd be talking to you today because, as you know, there was accommodation for less than 800 people in the lifeboats, and she was carrying 2,200. So it was a question as who was there in time to get into one of the all too few lifeboats. Well, they weren't launched very quickly, because at first no one thought anything was going to happen. But my father went away and spoke to an officer, and he said, they are going to launch the lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast. There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came up from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there. There wasn't any panic at the time I got in a lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there. And there were enough people there to just get into the lifeboats. But after that, when the others started coming up from their cabins and there were no boats, gosh, there was panic. We could hear it. Definitely.
As each lifeboat reached the water, it moved away from the ship for fear of the suction should she sink. Some rowed towards the lights of a ship which could be seen just a few miles away. This ship was never identified and never reached.
And of course there are still threats of legal things even these days about whether the ship that was so close to us was the Californian or not. I mean, I saw that ship. It's terribly close. And the other thing I'm saying is that I didn't see a ship 19 miles away. I saw a ship that was so close, and they said at the time it was less than 9 miles away. Now they're trying to say it was 19. I saw it, you know, it wasn't just lights on the horizon, you could see it was a ship. And I saw our rockets being fired, which that ship must have seen. Well, this inquiry says that they did see it, but they didn't think it was a portent of danger. But I would have thought in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of the night, that rockets must mean trouble.
The band now played a solemn air. Some say autumn, but popular belief says it was nearer My God to Thee.
Well, there's no question about the fact that they played, and there's no question about the fact that after we were down on the water and they were playing, they played one version of the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, of which there are three. I've had this out so many times. And the one they played was the one that was played in church some months after, when I was with my grandmother, and I was so frightened I came out of church. I ran out. I knew the tune so well. But they won't have it. The Americans won't have it. People say, no, it's not. It was just ragtime, but it wasn't.
The visible part of the ship apparently settled back slightly before it, too, disappeared beneath the sea. It was this settling that indicated the ship had broken in two.
And we rowed away from the ship as fast as we could, because one has to do that, because I believe the suction when a vessel goes down is absolutely enormous. And we rowed away, and I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink. And I saw that ship break in half. And for so many years, people have argued with me about that. But now at last, it has been proven beyond all doubt that she did break in half. I know she did, I saw her. And the forepart went down nose first, and the stern of that ship stood up in the water for quite a long time, or it seemed a long time to me, and then keeled over. And we heard the dreadful sound of people drowning, which was, unbelievable. And then, because our lifeboat was so full, so overfull, the officers called all the boats together and transshipped some of us. One in that boat, and two in that, and three in that, and I got separated from my mother. And that was the most terrifying thing to happen to a child. But the most dreadful sound of all is the sound of people drowning. The screams. Absolutely ghastly. My mother used to say sometimes, she couldn't get me to talk about it for years, but if ever anyone did talk to me, I said that, she used to say yes. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right. It's the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful. Dreadful.
Now there was nothing to do but wait for rescue. Among those standing on the upturned boat was Harold Bride, the wireless operator, who confirmed to his companions that the Carpathia was on her way. At 3:30 a.m., she was sighted on the horizon, firing rockets, and at 4:30 she was on the sea. The Carpathia arrived with the dawn, and by 8:30 had taken on board 705 survivors and 14 lifeboats, the rest being set adrift.
And we were picked up, as you know, in the morning by this little ship, the Carpathia, and the rescue of people from lifeboats in mid-ocean is quite a terrifying thing. These little boats, shall we say, draw up alongside, for want of a better expression, to what looks like an enormous vessel. She was quite a small vessel, the Carpathia, but she looked big from there. And then how do you get on board? You don't have a gangplank like you do when you're ashore. And so they opened a sort of, I don't know whether the word is right, a hatch in the side of the ship where the luggage used to be laid. And they threw down rope ladders, and people like my mother and other grown-ups had to climb up in mid-ocean up a swaying rope ladder, which she said was the most terrifying thing. A sailor behind sort of holding on. And then what can the children do? We couldn't climb up a rope ladder. So they got these big luggage nets, and the mesh is very wide apart. It's quite a big mesh. Children would have slipped through it, small children. Anyway, our legs and feet would have gone through. So each child was put in a sack. And I remember being petrified when I was put in that sack and it was tied round, and the sack full of these children were put into these huge nets, and quite safely, of course, hauled aboard. But that really was quite terrifying. Then having got on board, of course, I couldn't find my mother. And I didn't find her for hours, but eventually I found her. And I'm quite sure one of the most pathetic things must have been the whole of the next day, how these poor women, such as my mother, roamed about the ship looking to see if they could see the husband they left behind. But no one found anyone.
A silver memorial plaque has been left on the wreck as a mark of respect and to honor her as an official grave to the hundreds who perished with her, and as a tribute to a disaster which should never have happened.
I entirely agree with my dear Dr. Ballard's words. He said the whole thing was a tribute to man's arrogance, and I agree with that. That man can be so arrogant as to build something and claim that it is undestroyable, if you like. It's the most arrogant thing to say. True, if the Titanic had struck rocks or a tempest and storm and sunk, that would be one thing, but this was a ship that needn't have had any loss of lives. That, I think, is the most dreadful part of it. And as I say, all these years later, this interest is profound. And it's because there was no need for anyone to die. No one should have died. Had she had enough lifeboats with 2.5 hours and a very smooth sea, nobody would have died. And one life is worth more than the whole ship, surely. That is what I saw, that is what I remember. And there are hardly any of us now to share this memory, of course. I'm the only living survivor now that can remember it and get about, so to speak. I don't think there's anyone that can really tell the whole story of it, except myself.
Over 100 years ago, through a series of videos, we will show how it affects you today. This large insurance scheme caused a massive ripple effect of global deception and allowed the elites the ability to control the masses. We only ask that you keep an open mind and decide for yourself. We should start with the RMS Olympic, which was ordered in 1907 by White Star Lines, built by Harlan and Wolff and completed on May 31st, 1911. The Olympic cost $7.5 million or $187.5 million today, an incredible cost with so much to lose. Edward Smith captained Olympic's maiden voyage on June 14, 1911, leaving Southampton and arriving in New York on June 21st. While docking in New York, the tugboat O.L. Hollenbeck got caught in Olympic's backwash, spun around, collided into her, and was temporarily trapped under her stern. 3 months later, Olympic, under the control of the same captain, was in another accident, but this time it was anything but minor. Olympic collided with HMS Hawke off the Isle of Wight on September 20th, 1911. The Olympic suffered severe damage, which included 2 large holes above and below the waterline. Steel plating dislodged on over 4 decks, damaged the starboard propeller and shaft, as well as bent the keel of the ship. After the accident, Olympic made it to the port of Southampton for immediate but temporary repairs before limping to Belfast for a more permanent fix. Any accident at this time that involved a Royal Military ship was investigated by Her Majesty's Admiral Team. Although the details and eyewitness accounts showed that HMS Hawke was to blame, the Admiral's team declared that it was obviously Captain Edward Smith's fault. This was a financial disaster, as the blame went to Olympic and insurance refused to pay for the repairs. These repairs were going to cost White Star Lines approximately $2.5 million or $60 million today. The bending of the keel caused the ship to list to port, a slight lean to the left. This is something that is very important to remember. In order to expedite the repairs, Harlan and Wolff delayed the Titanic so they could use the starboard propellers in the Olympic. She was back in service November 29, 1911. In February of 1912, same captain lost a propeller blade on the way to New York and once again limped back to Belfast. This was devastating as it showed that the Olympic may not be repairable. This is where it gets interesting. But first, let's briefly discuss a little about the Titanic. To do this, let's go back to a previous picture. This is a picture of the Titanic after leaving dry dock, but before the completion. There are a few things that we need to pay close attention to. First, notice the portholes. The Titanic was made with 14, and the Olympic was made with 16 of these. Now notice the second deck. The windows, they are evenly spaced, whereas the Olympic has variations. Lastly on this picture, I need you to pay close attention to the upper deck. The upper deck is completely open with no promenades in place. Now let's take another close look at the Olympic. Notice the 16 portholes at the front of the ship, as well as the uneven spacing on the second deck. There are not many clear pictures, so we just ask that you pay attention to the outlines, as there will be better pictures but further away later. Finally, notice the top deck promenades. On the Olympic, not Titanic. Two ships, nearly identical, which would be a fairly easy task to switch. Press wasn't around the docks. Photography was in its infancy. All dishes and linens were interchangeable between ships. Letterheads and menus could easily be changed. The nameplates on lifeboats, 48 lifebelts, and names of the ships could have easily been swapped in a weekend. If only the two ships were at port at the same time. Oh yeah, they were together in Belfast for a week prior to the Titanic's departure. All of this could have easily taken place. But why would they switch the two ships? Could it be to purposely sink one for insurance reasons? We have to realize that White Star Lines was heavily invested in the building of three sister ships, the Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic. They were in serious financial trouble, and the only finished ship was constantly needing repairs. But would they really be willing to take so many lives for money? Well, what if they thought there was a foolproof plan to rescue all the passengers? Now we must discuss one more ship, the SS Californian. The SS Californian was a Leland Line steamship, which was part of the J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company. This was captained by Stanley Lord, and left Liverpool, England for Boston, Massachusetts, 5 days prior to the Titanic's maiden voyage. During this time, there was a coal strike in England, and coal was very expensive, and most steamships were very careful in only making very important trips across the ocean, and would never leave without full cargo. However, the Californian left without any passengers and only carried a large shipment of woolen sweaters. At 7 p.m. or 4 hours before the Titanic sunk, Cyril Evans, who was the Californian's wireless operator, signaled to all ships in the area the location of all the icebergs. At this moment, Captain Lord decided to stop the ship and said they would continue in the morning. Normally at this time they would have continued through the ice, or if too dangerous, continue on at half speed, especially on such a clear night. Why would he stop? Why during this coal strike would there not be any passengers and only a cargo of sweaters? Before continuing more on the Californian, let's find out what the Titanic is doing at this point. The Titanic's wireless operator Harold Bride received the Californian icebergs warning and delivered the locations to the bridge at 10:20 p.m., almost 3.5 hours after the warning was sent. Why did it take so long to deliver this message to the bridge? They were approximately 15 miles away from the signal, so they would have intercepted within seconds after the signal was sent. The ship didn't hit the iceberg until 11:40 p.m., so they still had the locations of the icebergs for an hour and 20 minutes. During this time, the Titanic changed course as if heading closer to the icebergs. During the later inquiries, we find that the ship strayed approximately 3 miles off course. Also at these inquiries, we find that the skies were clear and the icebergs large enough to sink ships could have been seen from 8 miles away, which would give the Titanic approximately 15 minutes to easily avoid danger. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic's lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted the iceberg only seconds before the Titanic hit. Why did the Titanic switch courses as much as 3 miles towards the ice? And why on such a clear night did the iceberg not get spotted? Let us once more go back to the Californian. At 11:10 p.m., Captain Stanley Lord and Third Officer C.V. Groves observed the lights of a ship to the south about 10 to 12 miles away. Captain Stanley runs to the wireless room to find out if Evans knew of any ship in the area. He did, only the Titanic. And then he instructed Evans to call and inform her that the Californian was stopped and surrounded by ice. A claim that then on-duty wireless operator for the Titanic, Jack Phillips, denied. Jack Phillips was a survivor. At 11:40 p.m., C.V. Groves clearly saw the Titanic as multiple decks were lit up. At 11:50 p.m., C.V. Groves watched the ship's lights flash out, as if she had shut down or turned sharply and that the port lights were now visible. This normally would have been cause for concern, but instead of waking Evans and have him contact the ship directly, Captain Lord tried to use Morse light signals. The problem with Morse light is that it is only good for 5 to 8 miles. As a captain, he would have known this, but still continued from 11:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. with no response. He refused to wake up Evans even after Groves informed him that the lights were flickering. At 1:10 a.m., now on duty Second Officer Herbert Stone notified Captain Stanley that the ship had fired 5 signal rockets. Stanley then asked him what color were the rockets, and Stone replied that he was unsure but he thinks they were all white. Captain Lord instructed the crew to continue signaling the other vessel with Morse lamp and went back to sleep. At 1:50 a.m., 3 more rockets were seen, and Stone noted that the ship looked strange in the water, as if she were listing. At 2:15 a.m., Stanley was notified that the ship could no longer be seen. So he asked one more time, what color was the signal, and again was informed they were all white. We must ask ourselves, why would the captain ignore a ship's distress call for any reason? And why were the colors so important? Ships used identifying colors in the flares. White Star Lines used the color white. Knowing that the Titanic was in the area, knowing that the signals fired at 1-minute intervals meant distress, knowing that your own crew members could see the ship in distress, and also knowing that you were the closest ship, why would they not help? Why not wake up Evans and find out in seconds what was wrong? Maybe there was something more important than the insurance money. We will get back to this in a second. At this point, we know one reason of why they would switch the 2 ships. We also know that they did have the ability to switch them. Now let's look at even more evidence. Lawrence Beasley, a Titanic survivor, and several others noticed a list to port, a slight lean to the left after leaving Southampton, very similar to the Olympics list. Let's also take a quick look at this picture. This is the clearest image of the Titanic side view. We know this is the Titanic as if you look at the bow of the ship, here, and zoom in, we can make out a few letters. T-I-T-A. Now let's go back to the overview of the Titanic, and pay attention to the second deck, evenly spaced windows. Also pay attention to the open upper deck with no promenades. Let us now take a look at actual photography of the sunken ship. Look at the propeller. We can see a stamp of 401. The Olympics number was 400, and the Titanic's was 401. However, after the HMS Hawke collision, they took Titanic's starboard propeller and placed it on the Olympic. Watch this original clip of the Titanic leaving Southampton. This is the supposed Titanic backing out away from port. In the exact location of HMS Hawke collision, we see unusually colored steel plates. Let's take a snapshot real quick. Do you see the discolorization right here? Why would this ship have repairs on its maiden voyage? Finally, Notice on the second deck the unevenly spaced windows and the promenades in the upper deck. This is the Olympic. Many people will contest what you see here, but we tried only to provide factual information and left anything out that we felt could be interpreted as fake or false information. Everything that we have found is freely available on the internet with some research. Now remember when we said that this leads to another conspiracy? Well, have you ever wondered, what if the Titanic wasn't sunk for insurance reasons alone? What if the sinking of the Titanic was for a much more sinister reason?
I thought the lucky priest, Francis Brown, was the one that told the captain to sink the ship.
Yes,
Wasn't he the lucky priest that got off when they went back to?
He's the lucky priest that got off.
I mean,
exactly.
he
right.
got off the ship and they gave instructions to the captain to sink the Titanic. And why did they sink the Titanic, Lenny?
Because 3 of the richest and most important men in the world, Guggenheim, Strauss, and who's head of the Macy's department store, and John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man in the world, blocked the Vatican Bank's takeover of the American banking system.
Those 3 men were worth $500 million
at the time.
And that would have been like billions and billions in this era. I mean, they were so wealthy. So their families were wiped out, basically, on that ship.
Yeah, the J.P. Morgan, as it says in the book, Bill Hughes's book, J.P. Morgan was ordered, and is substantiated by other writers, Eric Phelps, etc. J.P. Morgan was ordered by the Jesuits to build the Titanic. This unsinkable ship would serve as the death ship for those who opposed the Jesuit plan for a Federal Reserve System. So, and of course, Eustace Mullins, we had an interview. Sherman and I did a number of shows with him, and of course, he was a student of Ezra Pound's, and Pound was thrown in jail by the Warburg family because he knew that the Fed was a private bank and not owned by the people. So they threw him in jail. They wouldn't let him speak to a lawyer.
Well, you know, it's all out in the open now, but there's no money left anyway, so they just keep printing more, don't they, those families? I mean, it's called a Federal Reserve note.
The really is here, the new Assyrians.
It's absolutely here, isn't it?
We're watching the making of a new Assyria in Europe, and a new modernized Assyria decked with dictators and a Caesar, and a modernized Babylon is also being constructed right before our eyes, and that's why all that money is going to Baghdad, and all that money is going into the war effort. They're rebuilding Baghdad now. The Babylon and the Pergamum.
It's in Berlin in the Pergamon Museum, and they've reconstructed the gates and basically all of Babylon.
Now, aren't they
most of the walls.
Those gates back to Babylon?
They probably will move them back, but they're rebuilding it now. And I do recall that several months ago I stated that it was being built off-site.
Isn't this what?
So isn't it being built off-site?
Yeah, isn't this what Dubai is all about?
Exactly.
This is the lightning rod for how they're financing this new Babylon there, in Babylon, the old Baghdad.
Yeah, it's the old Baghdad.
You know, the old Baghdad.
They're taking bags of money there.
Well, we're told the Fed moved a printing press there. They've moved the printing press. They've got a printing press that they print American money from in Baghdad. So that's the next step to build the Babylon system.
In order to create the central bank, certain obstacles had to be overcome. First, those opposed to a central bank would need to be removed. And secondly, the law would need to be changed, or simply appear to be changed. To deal with the troublesome individuals who opposed a central bank, the Jesuits spared no expense. They built a ship of death called the Titanic.
The sinking of the Titanic was the design of the Jesuit order to get rid of the opposition to the creation of a central bank in the United States.
And the men on the Titanic were opposed to a central bank. They had to die. Among those were John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim, and a host of other millionaires who were opposed to a central bank in America. Therefore, they had to be taken out of the way. And they were on the Titanic.
The company building the ship was owned by J.P. Morgan, who was himself an agent of the Rothschilds family, the Rothschilds being the bankers for the Pope and the Vatican. The main Jesuit targets were brought on board. The captain of the ship was Edward John Smith. It appears from his actions that Captain Smith was a Jesuit coadjutor, that is, a Jesuit who has taken the oath but does not wear the robes. A coadjutor blends into the scenery and never looks like a Jesuit priest. It is a veteran sea captain, Edward Smith, who orders the ship to travel through an 80-square-mile ice field at full speed on a moonless night. There had been over 8 telegrams warning the captain of the danger.
He's warned 8 times, slow the ship down, slow the Titanic down, you're going too fast. Not once stopped. Knew there was an iceberg field up ahead, knew that he should have slowed down, but didn't. And so you look and you say, how was it that this man could go headlong into a field of icebergs and not slow the ship down, not be more careful? The only conclusion you can draw is, as a coadjutor of the Jesuit order, right through the line, the chain of command, he was told, sink the ship. And he did. On board the Titanic, and this is all documented in a National Geographic video that was put out in 1986. You can go to your local library and they'll either have it on hand or they can get it on library loan. But on that videotape, it shows that as the Titanic was coming up along the coast of England, it had various stops. And at one stop, a Jesuit priest got on board. His name was Francis Brown. Francis Brown got on board the Titanic, took pictures of all of the wealthy people, took pictures of Edward Smith, the captain, and then, just before the Titanic set sail across the Atlantic, Francis Brown got off. And then, of course, the Titanic sunk.
Well, Francis Brown is given a camera by his bishop, by his uncle, the bishop, and he is told to go down and take all these pictures of all these people we're going to kill in first class. And so that's what he does. He takes pictures of all these rich people, everybody that's there is going to go down, and a rich passenger offers him passage. Well, he knows the ship's going to go down, but he very sheepishly got in contact with his provincial. And the provincial's message was, get off that ship.
Like Brown, another noted passenger, Jesuit agent J.P. Morgan, did not make the ill-fated sea voyage. Even though booked on the ship for passage to America, Morgan also fortuitously canceled at the last minute.
Of course, J.P. Morgan, he had his own suite reserved for him. And there were some 55 men who at the last minute canceled their reservations on the Titanic. J.P. Morgan was one of them. Said he was sick. Oh, by the way, and don't load any of my art treasures on the Titanic either. So he didn't have any of his art treasures on it either. Didn't lose any of that.
How do we know there was foul play involved with the Titanic? When the iceberg was sighted, it was First Officer Murdoch who attempted to port around the deadly object. This was sound enough, but Murdoch also ordered the engines into reverse. Author Wynne Wade asked the obvious question. As long as Murdoch was trying to veer out of the iceberg's way, why had he jammed on the brakes, so to speak, by throwing the engines full speed astern? In point of fact, the 1910 edition of Knight's Modern Seamanship clearly contradicted Murdoch's decision. The instructions are clear. Avoid reversing the engines. Wade sums up the situation by saying, Murdoch had maneuvered in a manner more likely to cause collisions than to prevent them. As with many who investigated the Titanic disaster, author Wynne Wade was at a loss to explain Murdoch's actions in going against the book. But the captain and Murdoch's actions were not the only telltale signs of treachery on the night the Titanic sank.
We see all sorts of anomalies in the Titanic. For example, when it was sinking, the emergency flares were to be red so that ships in those lanes could see the Titanic was in trouble. Well, someone had taken away the red flares and replaced them with white flares, making it look like we were shooting off flares and having a party. And then the loading of the boats, we know that was a fraud. They didn't allow the lifeboats to be completely loaded. They were only half loaded, some 1/3 loaded, because the targets in the first class could not be allowed to board. And the Jesuits were not only the captain, but his officers, and there had been a strike in England at the time, and the men who were normally the ones who would man the ocean liners, they were replaced by Jesuit coadjutors ready to board because they were all under oath to die for the Black Pope if necessary, and so they did carry out the sinking of the Titanic.
But how is it possible that men will commit suicide as Captain Smith and some of his hand-picked crew obviously did?
We have to understand that these men have died to their own self-will. And so they have completely been emptied of their own personalities, and upon the order of their commander will do exactly what they're told. There's no such thing as a disobedient Jesuit. This serves as a warning to all the other men of power, not only in our country, but in England and Europe. You mess with us, and we're going to do to you what we did to all those people on Titanic, and we're going to thwart the investigation. Because a subsequent investigation of the sinking of Titanic blamed Bruce Ismay, the right-hand man of J.P. Morgan, and Captain Lord of England. They were the scapegoats, when they could have easily blamed the men of power at that time. Saw who canceled their reservations. It was a Warren Commission all over again. 9/11 Commission all over again. It's a whitewash and cover-up, and that cover-up is even more powerful than the murder itself.
After many of the leading opponents to a central bank had been removed, the Jesuits moved to obtain passage of the 16th Amendment and the Federal Reserve Act, both in 1913.
So they created the Federal Reserve Bank to finance their crusades. Without the Federal Reserve Bank, there's no war in Iraq.
Titanic, the 46,000-ton liner that couldn't sink, and she set out proudly on her maiden voyage to America. 2 days later, she hit an iceberg and went down with the loss of 1,500 lives. The impossible happened. there were no lifeboats for nearly half the people aboard.
Although 3/4 of a century at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean did not exactly preserve Titanic in museum-like condition, there is enough left of the wreck to give us more than just an idea of what really happened. Corrosion has done its relentless work, but where the original black paint of the hull has flaked away, it is still possible to see spots of grey paint, which formed the undercoat, except that grey paint was only used as an undercoat on the Olympic and not on the Titanic. Examination of the starboard propeller reveals the number 01 stamped into the metal. In fairness, there is too much corrosion to make out the number 4 clearly, but remember the starboard propeller, numbered 401 for the Titanic, was put on the Olympic as part of the repairs after the collision with the Hawk. Remote cameras under the control of the discoverer of the Titanic wreck, Dr. Robert Ballard, have examined the stern section of the ship. They show that in addition to the lateral bulkheads that were a feature of both the Titanic and the Olympic, there is a longitudinal bulkhead in the stern section where there was none on the original plans for either vessel. The position of this bulkhead suggests a temporary repair has been carried out to strengthen the keel, a keel perhaps damaged by the collision with HMS Hawk. And finally, a close look at the bow could reveal the most damning evidence of all. In 1986, the French National Oceanographic Institute examined the wreck with Dr. Robert Ballard. One of the things they checked was the name of the ship. In keeping with White Star tradition, both ships had their names engraved into the upper bow plates in letters 4 foot high. Examination of the wreck and the name Titanic shows that it is made of iron letters which have been riveted onto the original bow plates. With the passage of time, 2 of the letters have dropped off and been lost forever in the sediment of the seabed. At the place where they once were, engraved into the hull, are the letters M and P.